Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Culture and Coffee podcast with me, your host, Colin Ellis. Today, I'm going to be talking about the three characteristics of a toxic culture. I currently writing my next book. The manuscript has to be completed by the end of August, so I thought I'd share, some of the research that I've done. I have to say, it's pretty depressing. Research in toxic cultures. I think the book will be good. Because why would I say anything else? Yeah, I'm writing a book. I think it's going to be rubbish. You should definitely not buy it. But I think, what I found already is that there are some, not only there's some characteristics, I think people could have handled it so much better than they have done, and avoided some of the fallout, avoided some of the backlash. There were three stories in the press in Australia alone last week. There were two in the UK, and these were pervasive throughout the week. Anyway, we'll get there. Hope you had a lovely weekend wherever you are in the world. Well, I don't know. Maybe you listen to this on a Friday. So I hope you had a lovely week. Who knows? I spent yesterday watching Glastonbury clips on the BBC. I never made it to Glastonbury. I could never. My mates used to go, and I loved, like, when I was a teenager, even now, love my music, absolutely love I was never a musician, but I love my music. And yet I just couldn't bring myself to go to Glastonbury because I didn't want to have to deal with the toilets. I know that sounds ridiculous because that's part of this. I know one of my mates said to me once, he was like, yeah, but part of the attraction of Glastonbury is the toilets. I'm like, is it though? Is that part of the attraction? I just couldn't bring myself to go. Anyway, it's funnily enough, watching Glastonbury yesterday was like watching it in my own youth. Rick Astley was on. And then I watched the set with Rick Astley and Blossoms, where they covered the Smiths, my favourite group, the Smiths. And that was pretty cool. But I think Debbie Harry was playing. I'm recording this first thing Monday morning. I think Debbie Harry was playing yesterday, and Elton John's headlining. It feels kind of like a throwback glass. During when I was younger, it wasn't like a load of 70s bands were headlining. Guns N' Roses played, I think, as well. But it wasn't like, AC/DC and Led Zeppelin were headlining. They were playing, I'm pretty sure, but they definitely weren't headlining. It was people like Pulp and Radiohead and all the great bands. My daughter's really into the 80s and 90s, so I'm kind of reliving my teenage years and my early 20s vicariously through her. We're watching the Cameron Crowe movies. We watch Singles. We're going to watch Almost Famous at school holidays this week. She's like, Dad, can we have movie day? I'm like, well, firstly, I've got a book to write, but I'm sure I can take time out to watch a Cameron Crowe movie. Anyway, I hope you had a great weekend. Coffee. Now the coffee today is an instant. Now, before you're drinking an instant coffee, how dare you? So before you stop listening to podcasts, right, I can't. It's fancy coffee only or nothing. It is. It's an instant, but it's a fancy instant. And I have to say a huge thanks to Trevor Bradley at Flight Coffee. I was over in New Zealand last week, and I did a little post on Instagram from New Zealand, and Trevor Bradley, a friend of mine, got in touch, and he was like, how about we meet at the hangar? It was great to catch up with him, and also he gave me some samples to take away, which I've been merrily drinking all weekend. Now, I haven't had this one because I wanted to save it for this morning, but the other coffees from Flight have been absolutely fabulous. So if you're in New Zealand, get over to Flight or find a Flight coffee and indulge yourself in this. But yeah, it's an El Fenix from Colombia. Now, El Fenix is about, the farm itself is about 1,800 metres above sea level, and it's near Calaraca or Calarasa. I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce it, which is in the department of Quindio in Colombia. Basically, if you draw a straight line south from Medellin and then one straight line west from Bogota, it's kind of there, right? It's kind of there in the heart of Colombia, and it's, the farm itself is in the central mountains. You heard me talk in the past before about, these coffee farms are high altitudes where you get heat, sun, humidity. Volcanic soil is really good, but there's high sun, which they get in the valley here in Calarasa, but also a lot of rainfall as well. Now, instant, so far as I know, the way that you make instant, I may have done an instant in the past, I can't remember, is essentially they grind the coffee, brew it into like a really intense concentrate, and then they freeze dry it. So you can basically easily carry it about. Now, as someone who loves his fancy coffee, and I've done podcasts in the past from like Heathrow and places like this where I've used different kinds of instant coffees, but this is a proper like in a jar. If you consider like Nescafe, which is the most popular coffee in South America, funnily enough, it's Nescafe still. It's freeze-dried coffee. They can be really, really nice. But I do, I do like to support local companies. I like to support local growers, and that's not to say companies like Nescafe and companies like Starbucks don't do it. I'm sure they do. So this is an El Fenix. Let's have a taste of this. It's red cherry, apple, and clover honey. Should really have researched what clover honey is. I don't know what that is. Oh, that is delicious. That is so smooth. It's red cherry apple. For me, it's more like a dark red apple. That's definitely the flavour I'm getting. It's like a dark red apple. If I've ever eaten a dark red apple. Yeah, that is absolutely delicious. So thank you to Flight Coffee. I'll put the link to the website in the show notes. Get over there and order yourself some instant coffee. I was in last week in New Zealand to talk about hybrid work. Now, I've discussed hybrid work at length on other podcasts, so head on back to wherever you get your podcasts and search Culture and Coffee Hybrid. Talked a lot about hybrid. But we are seeing, I had chats with a couple of people last week. I did 2 speeches in New Zealand last week, and I had a couple of chats with people about hybrid work. And interestingly, one of the people that I spoke to said, "Oh yeah, we've got a slightly toxic culture at the minute, and it's because we haven't done hybrid very well." And I think we're going to see more and more of that. That hasn't actually played out too much in the media at the minute, anyway. But I'm sure it will do at some stage. Is a real kind of lack of communication, a lack of clarity around how you're doing this thing called hybrid. But anyway, I'm not going to spend the time talking about hybrid. I've covered it quite a bit on the podcast. So if you are interested, just go and search. Or if you've got a question, you can always email me. I'm always happy to answer questions as I travel around the place. So 3 characteristics of toxic cultures. These things were common throughout the stories that I've read and that I am reading at the minute. And literally there's one a day. So, particular areas I'm focusing on are the big, big countries like US, Australia, UK, India. I read one yesterday in Switzerland, like everywhere. They're absolutely everywhere. So these 3 characteristics, the first one for me is the most prevalent by a long shot. And the warning signs are there for all of them really, really early. But the first one is definitely the most prevalent, and that's poor behavior. Is organizations that either don't deal with or don't walk past, or they walk past poor behavior, right? Performance, not so much. That doesn't necessarily lead to toxic culture. If anything, not dealing with poor performance will lead to a stagnant culture, where people stop caring and just don't bring their best self to work anymore. Or it will lead to a combatant culture where people will get cross about the fact that there are people, and you might be one of them right now, you might be really, getting the lead out. I think that's a horse racing term. Where you might be pulling the stops out, all of the metaphors and analogies are coming out, mixing them all over the place here, where you might be doing your job really well. That's what I meant to say. And someone else isn't pulling their weight, right? And when the organisation chooses not to deal with that, we as humans, as employees, deal with it in one of 2 ways. We either get really cross, I can't believe it, I'm doing my job, I'm doing all the things, and Colin's getting away with murder over there. So we get cross, right? And we talk to our boss, well, why am I being asked to do this all of the time? Or we go the other way and we just stop caring. We're like, well, If he's not going to do his job, I'm not going to do my job. Well, if that's the way it works, then I'm going to do that too. And listen, this is, don't blame people for doing that. It's up to managers to deal with that. I've talked about it in the past. And if you haven't downloaded the white papers, and I talk about the skills that managers need to build cultures, I'll put the link to the white papers in the show notes as well. But that's generally how it goes. But when it's poor behavior, that's different. Now, gosh, so many leaders need to worry about toxic culture, which is why I'm writing the book. They need to worry about it. They need to be concerned about it, because toxic culture, a culture used to be this black box that nobody could see, and now it's visible everywhere. It's visible everywhere. According to one bit of research that I read, toxic cultures cost US organizations alone $50 billion a year. It's 10 times more powerful predictor of employee turnover. 10 times more than things like, kind of compensation and whether the organization's hitting their targets or not. It's adding healthcare costs. I got asked a question not long ago, and it was about mental health support. It was a really good question, actually, and about the cost of mental health support. And my point was that it's really important that you have health and wellbeing programs, but it's better if you focus more of it on health programs, and actually. Because kind of health and wellbeing is one of the two, but I often find that wellbeing programs are used because managers are rubbish at their jobs. Like, you can dramatically reduce the cost of your health and wellbeing programs if you put more time, thought, and effort into building a vibrant culture. Organizations with vibrant cultures don't really have to spend much on healthcare costs for employees. And they focus on well-being programs. They're more focused on health programs like yoga and stuff like that. It's harder to attract candidates. As soon as you've been in the media, it's harder to attract candidates. There's a big one playing out. There's a big one playing out everywhere at the minute. But the Confederation of British Industry, allegations of toxic culture, which they've kind of investigated, kind of not. But no one wants to join. And I've said that. They've come out and said that is because the organisation's found itself in the media. Nobody wants to join the organisation. Of course they don't. They've got to completely reset the culture in order for people to actually see it as a viable place to work again. There's one allegation at one. Now, in the book, I'm going to largely, in fact, I am completely going to talk about those toxic cultures that have been investigated. So I won't necessarily name this company, because this was a report on the news in the UK, and this is a kind of a government body that looks after the rights of humans where there have been allegations of a toxic culture, and bullying, harassment, discrimination. But they had an opportunity to deal with this behaviour. This behaviour had been about for a while. Now, sometimes it can just be one individual. Sometimes it's a group of individuals. But as soon as it gets spotted, it's up to managers and senior managers to deal with this. Otherwise, the risk is that it spreads. The risk is that it affects other people. And that's that classic, it only takes one bad apple to spoil the fruit bowl. Yeah, it does. And there's allegations around an organisation here in Australia at the minute that's playing out in the media, and it's led to a significant loss of business for this organisation. One person doing one thing that was unethical, and then somebody said something in an email that they shouldn't be doing it, but didn't feel it was their place to hold them to account. And felt that it was up to senior leaders, and they were kind of right, but also they did kind of have a responsibility, because culture is everyone's responsibility. And so what you've got is this kind of, it's not up to me, it's not my job, it's the leader's job, and the leader's totally new. And at that point, it's not one bad apple. At that point, it becomes everyone's responsibility. So that's the first thing, is organisations that don't deal with poor behaviour, or they choose to walk past it until eventually it just comes out. there's some of the stories I've been reading. It's pretty depressing, but some of the stories I've been reading were leaders knew what was going on and still did nothing. There's a TV show in the UK. They knew what was going on. Now there are people coming out saying it's got a toxic culture. They're saying, oh, the head of this TV company was hauled in front of government. And she said, we don't have a toxic culture. It's like, well, you kind of don't get to decide because it's a feeling of culture's a feeling. It's how people feel. If people feel that it's toxic, then you sitting there saying it's not toxic merely adds to the toxicity. Such is the way. All right. The second thing is when organizations actually don't take the time to define their culture in line with strategy, or worse is when strategy changes and they don't tell employees. Now, the best example of this right now is Meta. Right, that's the best example right now. There was a report in the media a couple of weeks ago that only 26% of Meta employees are confident in Mark Zuckerberg and confident in company leadership. And at that point, you've got a real problem when only a quarter of people are confident. Now, that confidence is derived from the direction of the organization. Largely, we gain confidence when we feel able to look at our leaders and go, we know where we're going. We know what the vision of the organization is. We know what our purpose and values are. We know what we stand for. And then you see leaders making the right decisions in line with that direction. We gain confidence from that. Usually it's got nothing to do with personal likeness, right? Confidence, you can dislike someone. And I still think we have this idealized view of our workplace cultures, like we just want to come in and be friends. No, it's not. Like that's a nice byproduct sometimes of work, that we create friendships. What we're looking for is to create respectful work cultures where people know how to work together, such that they feel a sense of accomplishment, they feel a sense of belonging, and the organization succeeds, and then everybody benefits. Right? And so you don't necessarily have to like the CEO of a company. You just have to have confidence in them. Now it's good if you do like the CEO, and after certainly the most vibrant cultures, who also feature in the book, by the way. But the vibrant cultures that, there is a lot of respect for leaders, but it's because they know what the direction is. And so right now, there was a very big fanfare, and you'll remember the video, if you haven't seen it, go and watch it, of Mark Zuckerberg and his avatar, and him getting really excited about, kind of the metaverse. And then a load of US companies jumping on the bandwagon and going, yes, we're going into the metaverse with you, and the yada, yada, yada. And it's all good, right? All for technology and advancements. Hasn't really panned out though, has it? And a lot of those metaverse departments that were stood up are now being stood down. But no one's saying anything about how that direction has changed. There were 10,000 jobs lost last year. There have been 15,000 jobs lost this year. And yet, you look at the stock exchange, so I'm looking at all of these things as well. How does the stock market view culture, right? And if your toxic culture hits the media and you're a private company, has an immediate, and I mean immediate, negative impact on your stock price. Not so much for Facebook, not so much for Meta, as a company. Meta's stock is up 100%, if you can believe that, year to date. Because actually the market's looking at it and going, actually, we're kind of glad he's ditching this metaverse thing, because we were never really convinced in the first place. Now, of course, different leaders look at different levers when they're looking at things like culture. But what I guess the example here is, if he ends up losing good people, then it's going to negatively affect the stock price as people leave. Right. So you have to be really, really clear about your strategy. And if it changes, you have to communicate that to staff, because if you don't, it has an impact on the culture. All right. That's what the research shows. Not only that, if you notice some poor practices, you have to deal with them. I'm going to be working with an organisation in a couple of weeks' time, doing a culture workshop, 2 days, right? And whenever I do my culture workshops, I always say, I have loads of meetings because they're all tailored to my clients. I want to know, well, what are the things that are holding you back? And for the most part, this culture seems very pleasant. It doesn't seem toxic in any way, shape, or form. But what they've got is lots and lots of poor practices that they haven't dealt with. And of course, the two most prevalent ones are meetings and emails. They're always the two most prevalent ones. And I go in and I give them a load of things that they can immediately do, and it changes the game. But people have got to want to do it. But you've got to reset the culture, right? So when you don't actually reset the culture to deliver the strategy, how do we deliver the strategy? What are the things getting in the way? Technology, the way that technology is used. And it's easy to ignore the small things, but they can have such a massive short-term and medium-term impact. Instead, we focus on metrics and data and numbers and all of these things, and we kind of forget that cultures are about people. And yeah, it's important that we hit targets and all of those things, but not if we're overworking people in the process. One of the things that I'm always critical about, and I joked about it in a speech last week, is leaders who are like, oh, we need to do more with less. Yeah, well, you can't, right? You can't do more. You can't do more with less people. It's just not possible. Yet it's become this throwaway line that people don't challenge for some reason. Now, if you do less, you end up doing more. And it's these kind of things, right, that really, if you shift the focus from we need to do more with less, to, all right, let's do less so that we can do more, and you shift the focus, people start to be like, okay, so we're coming out of this period of a toxic culture, because actually what we're going to focus on is fewer things at any one time. Right? And if you focus on fewer things, the brain's got a greater capacity to concentrate on those things and you get them done. And then that frees up capacity to do more. It's really, really basic, right? Multitasking is not a thing. It's not something that we can do. So they're the things when I talk about, the second thing about culture and strategy, it's those kind of small things. If you fix those small things, which actually turn out to be big things, you can avoid a toxic culture. And then the last thing is a real lack of equity in structure, or there's unclear decision making. So there's almost a story every fortnight at the minute about people who aren't paid as much as they should be, people whose conditions are different to someone of who might have a different gender, a different background, a different skin colour. There was a story in the UK at the end of last week. I'm trying to remember it now properly. What did I read now? Sorry, I'm trying to remember. It was like the top companies in the UK, or some of the top companies in the UK, had been fined, I want to say like £5 million or £10 million for pay breaches. And these were people like Marks and Spencer's. For anybody who's ever been to the UK, you'll recognise these companies. Marks and Spencer's, WH Smith. I particularly remember my very first job was working for a retailer called Argos when I was 16. And they were all fined for pay breaches where they hadn't paid people what they were worth, like minimum wage. They hadn't paid minimum wage. And they were all approached for comment. I've written it down as part of my research. They were approached for comment. Just excuse after excuse after excuse. Or we weren't aware of it. As soon as we were made aware of it, we rectified it. It was like, why haven't you got someone checking that you're paying people properly? How is that not a part? You've got people checking whether you're hitting targets. You've got people checking if how you can save money. But you haven't got, there's no one saying, right, it's Colin's job to check if we're paying people properly. The research said, the news article said things like, oh, it's completely unintentional. I think it was in the Guardian newspaper, if you want to search it. It was unintentional. As soon as we were told about it, we rectified it. I just think that's disgraceful. These are people who have probably no idea that they've been underpaid. How dare we treat individuals like that, especially if they're getting paid minimum wage? We can't be bothered to check people at the very lowest rung of the ladder that you're paying them properly. I also read a report, and this will come as a surprise to nobody, that we're still nowhere near closing the gender pay gap. Nowhere near closing the gender pay gap. And this is for people. This is for females in the same roles as males. Right? It's going to take something like 141 years to close the gender pay gap, providing we kind of maintain the things that we're doing right now. There's no reason for it to take that long. There really isn't. Organisations can look and say, who's printing off the spreadsheet and going, right, are we paying based on role here or individual? Right? Because it should be by role. And if the role's worth that money, it doesn't matter who's in it. It doesn't matter what the kind of colour of their skin. It doesn't matter their sexual orientation. It doesn't matter their gender. We pay people by the role, plain and simple. It's like the other thing in this, and this is where there's a potential for hybrid adding to the problem, is when organisations pay on location. It's like, well, if you're not coming in the office, we're paying you less. Why? It's the role that earns the pay, not the location, not the gender, not the sexual orientation, not the colour of the skin. And so, when I talk about the third thing being lack of equity and structure, that's what I'm talking about. Ultimately, I really don't want you to start going, what a depressing start to the day. Are you okay? Yeah, just listen to that Colin Ellis podcast. I feel so down and so depressed. These are all insights in how you can avoid toxic culture. And it's totally, it's avoidable, it's fixable, right? And in the book I'm going to talk about, there's a long lead time for this book. Don't get too excited. Manuscript's due at the end of August, which means it's likely to be out, next July, August. But then, don't get me wrong, I'll be mentioning it. As soon as I know that day, I'm going to be mentioning it every other podcast. But it's fixable. But you've got to act fast, you've got to act decisively, you've got to act with humility. Some people will have to leave the organisation if you've got a toxic culture and it's found its way into the media. They will, because that's what you've got to do. You've got to demonstrate that you're ready to reset the culture. And that's what being accountable means, is we're taking responsibility for this situation and we recognise we have to make some changes. And then you can start the process of change. But it is fixable. But the longer you let it play out, the more you ignore it, the more you ignore one of these three things, the worse it's going to get. Anyway, that's your Culture and Coffee podcast for this morning. I hope you enjoyed it. See you next time. Ta-ra for now.